Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Hoping that you can hear me. Would love to see some yeses in the chat if you can hear me, if sound is okay. The beauty of technology. I see lots of thumbs up. Good morning. Thank you so much. Good morning, Scott. Good morning. Great to see you all. Elizabeth, Jeremy, Terry, Luke. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We will go ahead and get started. Thank you for your patience. Good morning. I am Andrea Blackman, and I serve as our city's Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. I am delighted to be one of the co-hosts for this morning's Community of Practice. In today's Community of Practice, what I mean when I speak of Community of Practice, it means that those of us who have gathered here today, we are deliberate in creating spaces. We are convening a space that celebrates wins, that unpack challenges, that practice practicing, that build relationships across government, across our city. We're working hand in hand with each of you to lead our city and push those things that advance racial and economic equity. Again, we welcome each of you this morning to our first Community of Practice. Now, I am delighted because I get to share this stage with multiple co-hosts. I will be joined a little bit later by two co-hosts. I'll tell you who they are. But our morning today will be a gathering that will consist of 3 45-minute sessions with, don't worry, time in between for bio breaks. And if you have to leave at any moment during this convening, you'll have an opportunity to rewatch, because if you registered and you're tuned in, a link will be sent to you so that you can go back and rewatch it. Our other two co-hosts this morning for session 2 and session 3 will be Razel Jones, who serves as the Workforce Diversity Manager here in Metro for Central HR, and he will guide us through some actionable steps on what it means to create, to launch, and navigate a DEI vision, as well as strategies for remaining resilient and positive in the face of personal and professional and organizational obstacles that some of us may face when we're doing DEI work. And then our last session will be led by Dr. Sneh Patel, who is the DEI Policy and Research Manager in our office, and she will lead us through a conversation on how organizations and departments can leverage data and performance measures to realize and establish some new equity goals. Whether you are entering this space as a novice, as a practitioner, as an advocate, as a leader, as a data collector, as a director, as a policymaker, we have an entry point for you. And again, we say thank you so much for joining our Community of Practice. Now, before we get started, I do want to go over a couple of ground rules with you all. 18 months ago, when we entered into this new role that I'm serving in our new office, I spent a lot of time with each of you, several directors and elected officials who've joined us today, and community members and activists. And I asked you some key questions. One of the things that I was specific in asking you is an equitable and thriving city possible? Can they coexist? And if they can coexist, can Nashville be that equitable and thriving city for all of its residents? And if we are to exist in that space, what needs to be buried? What needs to be raised? What do we need to redevelop and reconfigure? I also asked you if we, the collective we, those of us who are on this call today, if we have the capacity to change social norms within Metro government and within our city. And since then, we have been working alongside many of you in developing equity goals, realigning your departments, leading internal assessments, working hand in hand with you. And I'm proud to say, as I said, we're going to celebrate some successes. Our office has successfully implemented our city's first equity tool. We've done some important work, just as many of you have. But even in that important work, and in some retrospect, as a collective, all of us, we're still tinkering on the edges of what it means to really embed racial equity in our organizations, in our departments, and in our city. And as practitioners, we realize just how much the interpersonal and the institutional are intertwined, and they are symbolic in doing equity work. What we know with certainty is that we cannot do our jobs with any real accountability, let alone make progress in closing racial and economic gaps, if we're not grounded in deep understanding that personal growth, individual journeys, organizational alignment, a collective vision, and a commitment by those with positional authority must be front and center and are critical of if our city is going to be successful. In today's convening, today's community of practice, we seek to normalize that language. We seek to normalize what it means to bring a community together to talk about some critical issues. Now, as a community, we know that we must welcome hard truths and change as critical parts of our work. These spaces will give us more spaces that we'll be able to break down some institutional norms, the norms of politeness and silence. It helps us name existing power dynamics and structures that were, even if unintentionally, preserving such norms and perpetuated oppression within our city and within our walls. I have often said to many of you that I am not the one person who is charged with fixing all of the inequitable issues in our city. This work requires all of us. When you think about the complexities of our city, you think about our city's history beyond geography, beyond zip codes, we must factor in how history played a role in crafting where we are today in our city. In order for us to see progress, we must take a collective and an adaptive approach to these issues. It requires that we think boldly, we think innovatively, and we think radically about what it means to transform our city. We require radical reformation of concepts and policies and practices where each of us can reach a shared purpose. And that shared purpose will bring us back to the original question that I asked you at first. If our city can be both equitable and thriving at the same time for all of our communities. So for those of you who have been doing this work like I have for some time across decades, we've been having these types of gatherings. We've been having these types of conversations around inequities and problems and identifying them as a societal issue. But very few of us on this call today have had those types of conversation with robust interrogation of the impact of racial and economic inequities within our departments, within our organizations, and within our city. But it is those larger conversations that has set us on a course for where we are today to radically reconfigure how we operate within our city, within Metro government. Over the course of the last 18 months, we have began that type of interrogation, that type of radical reformation. And today we're excited to launch our first community of practice. We're going to start off with our first session, the session that is entitled Centering Racial Equity. Now, historically, we know government has worked in a largely race-neutral way. We understand that. But cities cannot address racial disparities without first talking clearly about the historical, social, and the political meaning of what race means in our country, what it means in our city, and what it means in our government. We must tackle history. We must tackle those things that make us uncomfortable, and we must become comfortable with being uncomfortable. In our work as a practitioner, those of you who are practitioners, you know that, before we begin in dialogue and conversation, we have to set the tone. We usually ask you, how do you enter into this space today? And then we move on to establishing a group covenant and some ground rules. And I want to do that with us today. Even though we're not in person, I think it's important that we still establish some ground rules and a covenant for our time today. And that covenant means that, number one, we will recognize that this collective that have come together today, that we will strive to identify and work toward those historic harms that exist within our city and with our government. We will acknowledge that we all are systemically taught and have been taught misinformation about groups, not just our groups. We all are misinformed. We will agree that we won't blame ourselves or blame others for misinformation that we've learned. But instead, as a community of practice today, we accept responsibility for not repeating misinformation about what we may learn in the future. We agree to trust this process. You've heard my colleagues Razel and I say to you over and over again to trust the process. We agree to trust together. We agree to learn and grow and share together. We acknowledge that each of us enter into this space at different learning stages. Some of you, this is the first time you've ever had a conversation around equity. For some of you, you have been on the ground working, doing anti-racist work for 20 plus years. But together we acknowledge that we will trust this process because again, we're trying to get our city to be both thriving and equitable. We agree to respect each other. We will agree to respect each other's reflections and questions, and that includes chat. So we want you to be active in chat, but we also want you to be respectful. Both of these approaches, all of these rules and guidelines will guide us through our conversations today, but also guide us beyond today. We thank you so much. And lastly, we want to make sure that you understand and we agree that no one should be expected to speak for a whole race or a whole gender. This is an individual experience that will lead and bleed into a collective experience. So we acknowledge and we accept that. And lastly, we will share the air. That means that we will share the responsibility for including all voices in conversations as it relates to making our city more equitable. And I'm going to pause and share space and follow my own guidelines and my own rules. I want to kick off our community of practice today by being in community with two experts and two leaders who I have worked with for a couple of decades. They are practitioners, they are experts, they are creatives, they are grassroots activists, they are podcasters, educators, commentators, and bloggers. I'm going to invite to the stage with me this morning two people who are key members of our community of practice, and that is Tasneem Grace and Timothy Hughes. Tasneem and Timothy, please join us.
Hello and good morning, everyone. This is Timothy
Good
Hughes here.
morning.
I'm here and present. I'm having a little bit of difficulty joining on my laptop, but I am here. I'll be on camera in just a moment. Thank you so much for the invitation.
You're welcome. Thank you,
Good
Timothy.
morning.
Good morning, Tasneem.
Good morning. I'm in great company. Thank you all for being here. It's exciting to be at the first community of practice. Andrea, thank you for inviting us. Timothy, always great to be in your space, even if it's virtual. So good to see you both.
Thank you. And we'll wait on Timothy. We understand how technology goes. We know that cameras go on and off. We were having glitches this morning as well. And we do thank you all for your patience. So we're going to get started. We have a limited time together. You know that the three of us can be in conversation for probably, 4 hours straight without a break. But we'll be good stewards of time. And at the end of these 45 minutes together, we probably would have solved all of the world's problems, Tasneem and Timothy. Do you agree?
Well, I think we would attempt to, for sure.
Okay. Well, we will
And
attempt to.
if you had the time in all that we consider to be problems, we would still have some time for some celebration.
Thank you. Timothy and Tasneem, I am going to give you both a series of questions and our audience will join in and share some things in chat. And if we have time at the end, we have some amazing staff members who are going to be monitoring chat with us and we'll have time to ask questions. Timothy, we can see you. Good morning.
Hey.
All right.
Hello,
So
good morning. Good morning, everyone.
good morning. I am going to give you some rapid fire questions. I'm going to ask you both some of the same questions, but I have some specific questions that are geared toward your experience and your background. So if that works, I'm going to just kick us off in conversation. I want us to think about this session today. We're setting a framework. We're setting a framework for how we will convene and gather people who are ready to transform our government. We are trying to build coalitions within metro government. And what that is radical. That's radical. This is new for our city. It's new for our government. And I am excited about it. But it means that we have to have alongside of us those stakeholders who are in the nonprofit world, those people who are our elected officials, our city council, our community activists, all of them who are tuned in today. We are grateful that they're here with us. So Timothy and Tasneem, we cannot eradicate any ism, right? We know this because we have been on the ground doing this. We can't eradicate any ism until we start at the core. We must get to the core of where we are. The two of us, or the three of us, I'm sorry, we have worked alongside of each other for decades. We have grounded our work in history. We have grounded our work in people and in communities. We have grounded our work in policy and in practice. And more importantly, we have grounded our work in truth. And I want to start off with that centering and that framing. So Tasneem and Timothy, this question is for both of you. And I'll start with you first, Tasneem, and Timothy, if you could follow up as well. I want you to share with our attendees a little bit about your personal experience as a practitioner and how you have been able to address a particular historic harm in your work. So if you could give us a specific example, because we hope that, today's attendees take some nuggets, yes, as a practitioner, but also, oh, that's what it means to be in community. That's what it means to address a historic harm and change policy. So Tasneem, I'll start with you.
Thank you for the question, Andrea. Wow. It's always nice in the morning to have to sort of go back down memory lane. I'm interpreting your question as kind of like, how did we get here? How did I get here? And I love the idea of being a practitioner. I think it's a word that I embrace more than expert or anything else, but practitioner. I love the idea of it. And that you said earlier, we are practicing. Um, I grew up in central New York in a family that moved to New York as part of the Great Migration. So they had West African and Southern American roots. And my parents joined Sunni Islam as teenagers. So following Malcolm X and the different movements beyond being Southern Baptists, they became Muslims and raised me and my four brothers and sisters as Muslims. I believe that I developed an ability to be comfortable in the margins. So we would go to school and be known as those Muslim kids, or we had different holidays. Our holidays didn't have, during our holidays, the school was still in session. It was always kind of, we were different. And that has informed who I am as a practitioner. I walk into spaces, even with Mosaic Changemakers, even if I'm walking anywhere, wherever I am, I'm constantly walking into spaces trying to think about who is in this space and who isn't. Who is this space for and who is it not for? Who's invited implicitly and who's not? And that comes directly from my childhood. I was always trying to find a space where I felt like I had belonging, where I felt like my presence had relevance, and where I felt like people were expecting more from me than just being there, just taking up space and taking up air, as you said, but actually relying upon my insight, having interest into my story. So what I do as a practitioner now is think about creating those spaces so that when people walk in, no matter what aspect of the margins they might come from. They could be a member of the LGBTQIA community, they could be Latina, they could be African American, it does not matter. But when they walk into spaces that I help to cultivate, they feel like they're invited. And they're not looking for gaps to fill or place or little corners to slink into. They're not trying to put on armor or mask that sort of offers a contrived sense of comfort, but they're in the space knowing that they were already considered upon their arrival and even before their arrival. So my work as a practitioner is centered in that question, those two really, who's here and who's not? And then how do I get those who aren't in the space?
Thank you. Again, thinking about history, and you mentioned your family's, the Great Migration, and knowing that pattern and what it means. I'm reminded of a similar experience that when we were in Springfield and helping that community assess their readiness to do equity work. I'll come back to that in a later question. Timothy, same intro question. How did we get here? But more importantly, what type of historic harms have led you to do the work that you are doing now?
Andrea, thank you so much for that question. And it's always difficult to follow Tasneem. She has a wonderful way of laying the groundwork, setting the stage, and preparing the way. And I really appreciate and value that. What I think she described for me resonates with the idea of something I like to describe as radical community, radical hospitality. There is so much about that that resonates with my personal story. I'm a native of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Was born and raised there, a child of a school teacher and a military retiree. My father was in the United States Air Force for 25 years, and so we moved 15 times in 17 years. I was always the new person. We were always the new family in the neighborhood. And so the concept of radical hospitality, radical community, and reimagining what that looks like is something that is deeply resonant and important for my acculturation and my experience. So anybody who is doing the work of equity, who is trying to create spaces and places for those who have been marginalized or who have historically been excluded or not considered, it's critically important to understand and acculturate yourself to a framing that really centers a sense of radical hospitality. For me, in the work that I do presently, it centers primarily issues related to social justice, specifically in the electoral space, voting rights space. I would be remiss for those who are listening in on the call today if I did not remind you that early voting has started in Tennessee. Make sure that you get yourself out to the polls and exercise your ability to have your voices heard. But that centering, that perspective around understanding the needs of those who are most marginalized, connecting those things to the material needs of communities, whether those material needs are visible through, economic blight or gentrification, or if it's something more internalized, situations having to do with adverse childhood experiences or large, significant impacts of trauma. We've experienced those things here in the city of Nashville, most recently with the 2020 tornadoes. The groups and organizations with whom we're building power and building coalition were there on the ground to meet the needs of those folks who had lost their homes or who had suffered damage as a result of those storms and floods. It really looks like showing up in community with more questions than answers. Often the communities in which I am working and building power, they know what needs to be done, but they don't have a seat at the table. Or in some instances, they don't have a folding chair to allow them entree
Mhm.
into those spaces so that they feel heard and appreciated, or a microphone, or in some instances, a megaphone that will give them the opportunity to amplify the voices of the concerns and issues that they're facing. So it's important to show up with a sense of humility, to have an appreciation or an understanding for the history of how these communities have been blighted and marginalized and pushed to the edges of our city, both literally and figuratively in space, but also to show up with a listening ear. I am a firm believer that there is a divinity in mathematics or an algebraic approach to community organizing, where we show up with two listening ears and one open mouth. So we should be reminded to listen twice as much as we speak. It's critically important that those who are impacted by situations, policy, violence, and so forth, feel that they're being heard rather than being preached to or to being encouraged or being dictated to. Because the communities often who have been marginalized and have been traumatized have been suffering from a sense that they had not been heard. Dr. King would describe that as riots being the language of those who are unheard. So to avoid the instances of those acrimonious interactions, it's important that we show up with a listening ear and an open heart.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you
Mm.
both for that. And we're going to be a little bit more flexible and fluid as we navigate through. Again, pardon me for that tech issue that we just heard on that. I love the way technology is going in and out. But thank you all so much for your patience. Timothy and Tasneem. And Timothy, you used a quote
Mhm.
from Dr. King. This question, I'm going to start with you, Tasneem, on that. We all have heard, those who are attending today are from all walks of our city. They're elected officials, again, they're council members, they're grassroots activists, school teachers, people who work for the city. You have department heads. You have people who are saying that we would like to be a part of this radical transformation for our city and making our city and our government more equitable. And we've heard in our work, we know we've heard that, when we bring up the word racism or when we bring up the word anti-racist, that many people believe that, well, that doesn't really impact me, like that DEI office over there, that's your job to be equitable, to do the equity work. And racism is less, a little bit more obvious for some than others. I'm reminded of a quote by Dr. King where he said, everything we see is a shadow cast by that which we do not see. And when we think about the interpersonal and the institutional, the internalized and the structural, research has shown us that much of the psychological burden of racism that falls on people of color has been passed down through genes and through generations. And even something as
Mm.
subtle as a narrative about a particular zip code or our local history can create unknown, unseen, long term barriers for communities of color. we don't mean for this conversation to be overwhelming for those of you who are just entering this space. But if we do not name these dynamics, we cannot address them and radically transform our city. Tasneem, how might we begin toward that collective impact and a collective understanding of shift of what it means to say that this does impact me?
I love this question, and I know the language embedded in it is very sort of hot. Like when we talk about collective anything, there's both the comfort of being a part of a group, but I think there's also the invitation to disappear in the group. And I say that because there are people who become a part of collective movements and go into the shadows that Dr. King is talking about, because we can sort of hide from our own personal commitments to transformation. I don't believe collective impact begins with collectivity. I think it has to begin with the individual first. I think it begins with thinking to yourself the very thing that you're saying these communities need, whether it's the community you live in or community that's nearby, is that benefit, that equity, that advancement, is that already present in your own personal life? We get very interested in what organizations are doing and institutions are doing, what policy is doing, what government is doing, and that starts to feel like big groups of people doing things and big groups of people making choices, and we don't necessarily turn the light on in our own personal lives. I'm not yet convinced that if there's a disconnect between how I run my household and how I run my business, if that disconnect is so broad that there's going to be an integrity in either place. So my challenge is to say, how do we shift toward a collective impact? It's by first maintaining our focus on personal impact. How do I care about a different zip code? Why would I care? Dr. King talks about apathy and how apathy is like the poison that's embedded in all of us. It's the lack of consideration. It's the ease with which I say that doesn't affect me. It's not my neighborhood. And so, like, if I don't challenge that, then that will undergird all my efforts. I mean, I'll show up for the meeting. I might even march. But when I go home and I look around who's in my house and who's not, I get to ask myself that question too. Who's at my own dining table, not the table in the office lounge, but the one in my house? Who do my children consider to be family or people or tribe? If I don't have all the things that I say is important for the community and the community I live in my own house. And I've had to call myself out on that. I've had to go, ooh, I don't know, Tasneem, that your actual lifestyle as a mother, as the head of this household, reflects what you say you believe in professionally. So that which I'm saying the institution needs, what about the institution that I am as a human? I listen to my daughters, and sometimes they will say things that let me know I got some work to do. And then that lets me know that the collective impact angle of what I'm trying to do, this idea of Black, brown, and gold leaders coming together to connect, to grow, and support each other, this idea of solidarity, we have all these beautiful words, Ubuntu, all of that. I am still believing that I have to till my own soil first. I had a delivery man come to the house last week delivering from Walmart. His car was unmarked. He had on no uniform. My 11-year-old shouts, "Mom, there's a white man at the door." And I thought, oh, wow. She didn't see anything, but it was a white man. And for her, white man meant stranger. And so for me, I said, okay, Tasneem, you do this work of inclusion. You do this work of talking about who's in the community. You have lots of good things to say about who's not in the room. Well, guess who's not in the rooms of my house? And what does that mean? And what does it mean for an 11-year-old to see them as other if we're also seen as other? And so for me, the collective impact is looking at the shadows that we cast in our own lives before we get to the place of casting shadows and trying to see into the darkness of the institutions we're in. I don't think we start at collectivity. I think we start in the personal.
Thank you for that. Timothy, I have the same question. We have some members in chat saying, Randall and ITS saying thanks. Karen also said, when we start tilling our own ground, and one of our colleagues, John Royale, said, when we change ourselves, we change the world. And Tasneem is reminding us, before we can get to that collective impact. And all of us are in this space today because we want that thriving and equitable city, right? We want Nashville to be that city. You're saying, Tasneem, that we're challenged because we must start with ourselves first. Timothy, let me hear your thoughts on that. How do we get, all of the attendees and all the work that we do and all that we're showing up in these places? How do we get to that, to get all of, Nashville collectively? Sometimes we get tired of the individual work. If I'm showing up individually doing this work day in and day out as a practitioner, committed my life to anti-racist work, I'm ready for the collective impact. Where do we go from here, Timothy?
I think it's so critical, Andrea, that we understand the balance that's necessary. I think that Tasneem really lays out a very important lesson about the interpersonal. The element about that being, of course, the personal. We have a responsibility as individuals to make a contribution to this work. I think that it also shows up in the ways that we understand what doing this work is really about. It's really about making sure that we are building upon the base of knowledge that we currently have, and that we're making steps toward building a more equitable and fair society. And we do that step by step and moment by moment in our interpersonal interactions. It looks like trying and understanding new and maybe even complicated ideas with which you might not be familiar. Being in spaces, allowing yourself in spaces to be uncomfortable, to make mistakes in situations that sometimes allow you a level of learning and experience that can be difficult, can be challenging and uncomfortable, but sitting with that discomfort in ways that is constructive. It looks like venturing into communities and into spaces where you may be the only person who looks like you, where you may be the only person with your perspective, your ideology, your point of view, and understanding that you can hold different ideas together. Multiple things can be true simultaneously. Dealing with the level of complexity and nuance that's a part of our lived experience is critically important. And I think that what we've got to do is we've got to enter beyond just safe space. We've got to enter into what I would like to describe as brave space. Sometimes that means taking a risk. It means going into a situation or a circumstance where you might not feel like you have all of the tools, and being prepared to understand that that learning is a process. And those learnings can take place. It could look very specifically like, I know that most recently for myself, my background in music, I've primarily worked in spaces and in areas where I've been introduced now to lots of different kinds of artistic expression, music being one of them. And so one of the wonderful spaces that I love to go to is Plaza Mariachi. Friends of mine, we love to go into that space as I'm trying to practice and learn more about Spanish language and culture and its expressions in multiple cultural ways in Nashville. Plaza Mariachi has been one of those spaces that I can go where I feel safe and I feel welcome. There's wonderful food, there are wonderful people. It's been intentional in creating an environment that's welcoming for folks who may not be from that part of the city or may not even speak Spanish, but because of the intentionality in the creation of that welcoming space, I feel welcome. Whether or not I'm a part culturally of that particular experience, it's something that feels welcoming. It returns back to that idea of radical hospitality, which really centers our shared experience. And so when we understand that while there may be things that differentiate us, that make us unique and special, there are many things that will unite us. Things like food, things like culture, dancing, artistic expression, leaning into those elements as a way of building trust and building relationship are key and critical to being able to break down some of those barriers of misunderstanding. And so I encourage those folks who are on the call, first of all, for being here, because it takes a willingness to understand and a willingness to reach out and build community, to bring oneself to this kind of space, but also an understanding and appreciation for all of the many ways that we show up in spaces, the ways that we contribute to one another, and the mutuality of experience. The desire for us to build a greater and more beloved community together is something that keeps me returning to the work. And I think it's one of the things that we continue to see as a center point for what it is that we can bring to the work more generally.
I agree with
Love
that.
that.
I like that. Tasneem, I know you too, and he said the beloved community. I know that resonated with you as well. And thinking about a project that you did with the whole accurate with the letters of beloved and what that meant to that group of people. Oftentimes, these conversations for the three of us are normal, right? Again, but what we're talking about is radically transforming our city and our government so that department heads, elected officials, and all of those who are attended today and grassroots activists, that we literally are doing a new thing, a new type of thing radically, and not just changing my zip code, not just feeling welcomed when I go to Plaza Mariachi, but we're operating and leading our departments, and we're leading those organizations that we lead with that same type of what do you call it, radical hospitality, Timothy? Like, if there's a
Yeah.
place for radical hospitality in government, I think there is. There must be, in order for us to get to that place that we answer the question, can Nashville be thriving and equitable for all of our communities? Oftentimes, both of you realize that when we open up this Pandora's box and we start having conversations around certain histories, that's my air quote, certain histories, or we start having conversations around any of the isms, you name them, particularly race, there's often fear. And we want to stop the progress. We want to stop the conversation. We want to do the work that's easy. We want to do a checklist of a diversity class. We want to just get it done and we're done with it, because it requires us to be vulnerable. It requires us to do the introspective work for us to move forward. As we prepare to engage this group, this new community of practice, this group in conversations just as we're having today, I want you all to consider this question. So if we're so afraid of having questions around history and race, what do you think we are fearful of exposing about ourselves, about our city? What are we afraid of? Where does that vulnerability come from? What do you think we are afraid to tackle? Why? Tasneem, you want to start?
I love that question. I think about the beauty of the word that Timothy's given us, this word hospitality. And we go into spaces and actually become uncomfortable if we don't get it. If you go into a hotel and they're not like, welcome, you feel like, oh, I'm seen. Someone wants to serve me goodness and kindness. I think that what we're afraid of is that that can be an illusion, that we're not as nice as we think we are, that we're not as self-aware or socially conscious as we think we are. There's the Southern protocol of politeness, baby girl, sweetheart, bless your heart, darling, that maybe underneath all of that is barbed wire, and we don't necessarily want that to be known. I think that for myself, what am I afraid of? Perhaps that this conversation sometimes takes up more airspace than the conversation about joy and celebration. That it threatens the illusion of all rightness. So that if I face these things that are wrong, what if I find out that all of it's wrong? And so instead, we have the seduction of the illusion, right? We pay attention to things that don't really pierce our consciousness much. And you and I have talked about this. We'll talk about Michelle Obama's arms, but not talk about the arms in Iran and Ukraine. We don't want to talk about those arms. And so, there's a nervousness that I think we get into. What is my role in these harms? How do I perpetuate them? What if I'm not just the victim? What if I'm also assaulting people? And I think that the good news is acknowledging what the shadows that Dr. King talked about. Once you see it and recognize that we're all playing a part in it, and even some ways benefiting, that's a hard one to think about too. How does white supremacy serve us? Oh boy, all of us. So once we start to ask these questions, and maybe even become hospitable toward ourselves, Timothy, right? To say, I will compassionately ask myself this question. What is hurting me in recognizing these harms? And really start to slowly, compassionately, maybe in community, have these honest talks. I think that then we can recognize that these are perspective shifts. So the very thing that I believed last week, I don't have to believe it tomorrow. The very thing that I grew up believing as truth, I can look at a different set of facts and change my mind. I can then begin to walk into spaces and say, I don't always have to be the only person in the room with a certain amount of melanin. I don't have to be the only woman. I don't have to be the only cisgender woman. I don't have to be the only anything. So like all of those things that we know to not be true, there's an opportunity to see a new thing in a new way. That is always there waiting for us. But the tension to get there, the ache in the muscle as it grows. It's why some of us just would rather sit and watch TV rather than exercise. Or for me, eat a plate of French fries rather than eat a plate of collard greens. Like it's all these choices that we make. We know it's good for us, but it might take a little bit more work. But I think we're afraid of the truth, Andrea. We're afraid of the truth. The lie looks good sometimes, and that's human nature. But we don't have to stay like this. We don't have to stay there. We can evolve, and we're evolving.
The
Yeah,
lie
we're
is
calling.
Timothy,
so
you feel me on
seductive,
this one?
right,
Yes,
Tasneem? I
Timothy
really
joined in.
do. And I think that it has a lot to do with the fact that the vulnerability that comes with the not knowing, with the
Mm,
uncertainty, is can be terrifying. It can be, it can be a fight or flight or freeze kind of moment for so many. And I think for me, it really is about a recognition that there's so much about ourselves that we are on the process of discovering and learning, and we have to give
mm,
ourselves the space and the grace to learn and to grow. It's like what we say to children as they're growing in their understanding of the world. Don't be so much afraid as you are curious. Always be curious and
mm,
interrogate, because there are ways in which we can approach the world, uh, that a world that can be, at times very, very dangerous, with an
mm,
understanding that while danger is real, oftentimes what we fear is the unknown. It's what we don't know that we fear the most. So it's important for us to have an acculturation of curiosity, to explore and understand. It's part of the reason why, despite the fact that we face such difficult circumstances at times, and we're emerging from an ongoing pandemic, there are many challenges that face the city regarding housing, economic issues, and we're in a very critical moment, a linchpin moment. We've got to maintain a sense of and an acculturation toward joy, and it's hard to find
mm,
joy sometimes when everything seems so bleak, but it's part of the reason it's part of the reason that we've been able to sustain ourselves thus far. It's how we've gotten to this moment, is having an anchor in curiosity, in joy, in a willingness to explore and to understand. It's a pioneering spirit that has led us to this moment, and we need to remind ourselves of that in even small ways. I think that
mm,
that's what has made me so committed to this community. It's what drew me to Nashville. It's what keeps me here. The sense of abiding joy. Um, Stories like those of the Fisk Jubilee Singers, who went out from Fisk University 150 some odd years ago, had just emerged from chattel slavery, exploring a broader world in a desire to save an institution that brought us, one of the first forms of American music, the slave spiritual, the gospel songs. And those
mm,
songs were about hope, right? Those songs were rooted in a sense of joy in spite of circumstances. And there's a lesson in that for those of us who live in the city and who are facing these tremendous challenges, to understand that joy can be restorative. Joy can bring us to, and not just joy in an ethereal kind of, blissful sense, but a rooted sense of understanding that if we are persistent, and that if we work together and stand with one another, we are stronger than anything that we face. And that can bring us a sense of hope and of steadiness in unsteady and difficult times.
Thank you both.
mhm,
Timothy, you gave me a great segue as we think about history. I see our friends in chat are chiming in. They are giving us some great comments. So I hope you both are paying attention to what's going in chat.
mm.
John and Ellen and
Yeah.
Daniel, thank you so much for joining in on chat. And they also are part of this community of practice. And so we salute all of that. It's important for us to think about a collective understanding. The three of us have worked together to educate thousands of people in our city, thousands of people outside of our city, on what, Nashville's role during a particular time, whether that's, as you mentioned, Timothy, looking at, the history of Fisk Jubilee Singers, or Tasneem thinking about what Nashville role played, what Nashville played during the modern civil rights movement post Brown. We all have been doing this work and making sure that we have a collective understanding, to make sure that institutions and leaders have a collecting understanding. The great James Baldwin said, yes, you both knew I was going, like this day was not going to end without us bringing in James Baldwin into this space, correct? So the great James Baldwin said to us in The Fire Next Time, he said to accept one's past and one's history is not the same thing as drowning in it. It's actually learning from it. So we're not drowning when we acknowledge the history. We should be learning from it. It's an important for those of us who are making policies to clearly understand our city's history. For those of us who are realigning our departments and our neighborhoods and our communities and getting amendments passed, it's important for us to understand our collective history. I'm thinking about, Taz named some work we did in Springfield, Missouri, when the entire city invited us. We're talking about a city that is 98% white and no longer wanted to be a city known as 98% white. This is a city that invited us in to immerse ourselves, to test their readiness to begin equity work. We were gathered around elected officials and local government, higher ed, community activists, library staff, people from all over the city. And they wanted to figure out, are we ready? But do you remember the first part of that conversation was this group of people and this city saying that, how did we get here? We got here because four men were lynched in our town square. And when we think about that impact on generations, on structures, on policies, on demographics, we had to start there. So if you two could just briefly, because I have several questions, I have like 10 more questions, but if you could briefly talk to us, Tasneem, a little bit about that collective understanding and what it meant for that group in Springfield.
Thank you for that memory. That was a powerful experience that we shared there. I'm remembering that in our 3 sessions that I think we did, one of the overwhelming expressions was, we don't have to do this work. Do you remember they said that? We don't have to do this. We could just stay just the way we are. We're fine. I think the collective understanding was that it would be easy to just say they're Springfield, Missouri, and to stay in the demographic that they identified with, but they started to reframe what it meant to use the word us. I think they started to recognize that the us was a global us, regional perhaps also, but certainly global. So if we're in this bubble and diversity is something that only happens outside, and race is a word other people use because, we don't have other races. It's just us. And everything for them was, us. We're safe here because this is us. And you push them to say, yeah, but how did it get like this? Because there were people of color here. And I remember the silence in the room. Where did the people of color go? And why did they leave? And I remember the silence in the room because the truth is they ran and left to save their lives. There was once a thriving community there. I think that many cities have the same exact story. There was once a thriving community. Where did they go? Well, let's ask that question. I think once the collective understanding was that what we believe the truth to be now, that was what, 2017, 18 maybe, that it wasn't always this way. And so being able to say, how did we get here and what was here before helps to create a different kind of collective understanding. And that's what we witnessed in Missouri at that time. If I'm just going to say I live in an all-white community where race is a word that I don't really have to speak because there's no one around me who looks different than me, and you shift to, but wait a minute, this isn't the world though. The world is in Technicolor. There's a mosaic of people out there that I either see myself belonging to or not. And so what do I have to do to understand that I belong to that place? I was born into that place, whether or not I acknowledge it. That was the shift, Andrea. It was the question of, how did we get here? Why does this place look like this?
Thank you for that. And Timothy, I heard you, and I think you were speaking to a group before, talking about some of your work in some rural parts of Tennessee and thinking about communities that decide that we are going to change. We're going to do a collective shift, even if we aren't called to, or it doesn't look like it's supposed to. You want to talk to us and answer that same frame of that collective impact?
Absolutely, Andrea. I'll take it a step further and even talk a little bit about our own collective remembering here in the city of Nashville. I mean, we talk about the history of how it is that we got to be such a cosmopolitan city and what happened with the construction of the interstates back in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, a thriving Black metropolis in North Nashville that was bifurcated by the interstate system. Talking about that history, very uncomfortable, difficult, challenging history, but it also helps us to have a framing and an understanding for how it is that we get to a North Nashville that has a zip code, which, Brookings Institution described as one of the highest rates of formerly incarcerated persons in the country. We need to follow that historic arc. Dr. King talked about how the arc of history bends toward justice, but it doesn't just bend. We are the ones who have to bend it. We bend it with our collective remembering and our understanding how it is that we are situated in that time and that moment in history, both today and in the past. But in the work that I have been doing around conversation and community, a lot of it really centers a desire to help communities to both collectively heal from the traumas that they may have experienced, but also be able to speak to one another across what we see of as perceived divisions. I'm reminded of an experience that I had at the Women's March. I was invited there to facilitate a conversation with a few folks in Rutherford County. It was a wonderful and welcoming experience, but I was there on behalf of a group called Black Voters Matter. I was acculturated, if you could imagine. I had a black hoodie on and I had some Timberland boots, and I go to a lot of spaces in the way that I'm generally comported in the spaces where I organize and work. And so we're out in the community, and I have a particular way that I show up. So I walk into this space. There are 150 folks that are roughly who are gathered, and I'm the only brown person in the room and one of the only male persons in the room. And so the topic of the discussion was how to talk about issues of race and class and still get invited to dinner. And so the conversation started with a discussion around how it is that we show up into spaces and how we are greeted, the many differences that we observe about ourselves and that we may experience within those communities, but then about the commonalities that we can find, even in those spaces where we might seem very isolated and alienated. And one of the moments that really sticks with me is that, I'm surrounded by these folks who are, suburban folks and rural folks, predominantly white women. And many of them are saying, when you came into the room, I wasn't sure exactly what we were going to be talking about. I thought this would be some sort of an indictment of white supremacy, and this would be a very critical and intense space. And there were tense moments, but there was a mature lady there who was a grandmother, and she said, "I don't encounter a lot of people of color in the spaces that I'm in. I'm in a very rural part of West Tennessee, but I just want to thank you for coming into this space and being so hospitable, greeting me and welcoming me when I entered the space. It put me so at ease." And I could talk a little bit about these experiences that I've had in spaces where I felt like I was pushing against the tide, where I felt like I wasn't going to be heard, or that people were going to make assumptions about me because I'm an old white-haired lady and I come from a small town and I may speak with a particular accent. But you met me where I was. You didn't speak over my head. You didn't talk about me. You spoke and engaged with me. And I felt valued and appreciated in that space. And I think that that's what folks are looking for, whether it be in urban communities or in small rural towns. They want to be heard. They want to be seen. They want to be asked and they want folks to be curious about their experience. And when people feel heard and their voices feel amplified and there's a sense of trust that is built through communication and curiosity, I think that we go a lot further in terms of our building of relationship. And that trust is what allows us to be able to build the community that we're hoping to build together. Um, that environment and that experience was something that was very, very different than most of the spaces that I'm in. I generally am in Black autonomous spaces around organizing, but it was so gratifying to see that we could have differences where we might disagree, but not, again, to borrow a phrase from Dr. King, be violently disagreeable. And it was in a moment and in a space where, there was a political environment, there was a political election that was going on in 2020, a lot of different opinions and ideas where we have different perspectives about which directions we should go. But we all believe that there should be a sense of shared humanity. There should be some ground agreements that we understand about our basic rights and privileges and the ways in which we can
see ourselves in community with one another. And if we keep showing up, and if we're willing to show up with a sense of curiosity rather than a sense of animosity, I think that we can go a lot further.
It's perfectly said. You both have, we are like really out of time. And as I said earlier, we can do this all day, which we do this all day. And so we do this often every day. We have committed our lives to asking those questions that you both pose to us. We show up in spaces, we show up curious, we show up not coming in to change a policy, but also to give voice for those voices that have been left out. We each show up in our jobs and our roles ready to be radical, as Timothy said, but be, radical, this hospitality. I never thought about being radical as it relates to hospitality. I'm truly thinking that that's your new Southern thing, Timothy. But I want to just take a minute to thank you both. Tasneem Grace, who serves as the Vice President of Mosaic Changemakers, and Timothy Hughes, who's was graduated as a cohort member for Changemakers. The two of you, and I'll give a shout out to that organization because I believe that's what it means to be in community, right? We are creating a community of practice. You both have listed so many resources for those who are joining in with us. This is the beginning of our conversation today. I appreciate your insight. I appreciate you both. Thank you for joining us with these amazing words. It has been impactful. Those people who are tuned in will now leave from today going back to their departments asking, how do I show up? Who's not at the table, Tasneem? You said, when I'm in that space, who's not there? And Timothy, you've also reminded us of some key things of how this is the work that we must collectively do if we're going to see progress without ignoring the historic harm, without ignoring what history means to our communities. So we are curious. We are getting ready to be even more curious for our session two. Tasneem and Timothy, thank you both. I so appreciate your time joining us today. I will say for those of you who are tuned in, this is the beginning. I said this is our inaugural first community of practice. We will have multiple. This is an ongoing series. So Timothy and Tasneem, thank you. I know you both had other obligations, but recommitted your time to join us and share some nuggets with us this morning. Thank you so much.
An honor and a privilege to be with you. Thank you so very much.
Same here. And for those of you who are tuned in, we appreciate your comments and chat. Thank you for the inspiration. Again, this is our community. We are all being radically transformed together. Those of you who, John, I appreciate those things, you and Daniel and Ellen and everyone else. Susan, I've seen what you've added into chat. We thank you. So we will continue to be curious at 10:15 for our next session. Take a break. Do all the bio things you need to do, and we'll see you right back here at 10:15 for our next session. Thank you all so much.
Welcome back. Welcome back. I am enjoying myself at our community of practice event. My name is Razel Jones. I serve as the Workforce Diversity Manager in Central HR for Metropolitan Government of Nashville and Davidson County. So glad to be with you all today. We are excited for this event. We're excited to gather together people, as Andrea spoke, that are at various levels on their journey of doing the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit of time with you this morning. I'm so excited for everything that has been shared already and looking forward to what is to come. I was waiting for Andrea to bring James Baldwin into it, and I wanted to start right there. What the quote that she selected is, to accept one's past, one's history, is not the same thing as drowning in it. It is learning how to use it. Everything that we have been through, everything that we have experienced, both individually. Thank you, Tasneem. I wanted to make sure I got your name right. Individually, but even organizationally. And so many of you today are a part of the organization that we are working wholeheartedly to begin to really usher us into the next dimension of functionality and visioning in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or inclusive excellence. Baldwin's quote continues, though. It's not only, it is learning how to use it. The next part of what he said is, an invented past can never be used. An invented past can never be used. And many times we want to paint a pretty picture of where we have come from. And we want to come up with new narratives that explain away certain things and that give excuses at times for certain things. But an invented past can never be used. He said it cracks and crumbles under the pressures of life like clay in a season of drought. And so we have acknowledged this morning that we have a context and a history of some historic harms and some situations that have gotten us to the point where we are right now. Even organizationally, we have not always been focused on this work, but we are excited for where we're going. We will not eradicate and wipe out the truth of our history, but we will learn how to use it. And that's what we're here for at this community of practice. As I thought about that term, community of practice, the instant automatic question that comes to mind is, what are we practicing? What are we practicing? And I so enjoyed Timothy encouraging us to practice reimagining radical hospitality, to consider people before they arrive. I enjoyed Tasneem telling us to practice doing the work of DEI, of diversity, equity, and inclusion as individuals before we can move to a collective, looking at who's in our rooms, who's in the rooms of my actual physical house, who sits at my dinner table, who do I invite in? And then Timothy encouraging us to practice allowing ourselves into uncomfortable spaces and keep on showing up with a sense of humanity versus animosity. And so we are practicing being better agents of renewal, agents of change, agents of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, when I go back to my history, I played a little sports. I wasn't an amazing athlete, but one of the things that I learned is that practice is designed by many coaches to make you tired. Not just for the sake of making you tired, but it is the work. It's the working out. It is the repetition. It's the down ups. It's the running the laps. It is all of that that begins to build within you a certain endurance, an endurance so that you can keep on running the race even when you're tired. And I came today to speak to you all, to speak to this group. Many of you have been doing this work of diversity, equity, and inclusion for a long time now. Many of you have gotten to points where you are at times weary. If we're going to keep it real today, we're going to keep it real. Sometimes we are tired of being the representatives of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sometimes the load gets really heavy, and sometimes we feel like giving up. But I want to encourage you today to remember that in order to do the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it requires you to find a way to be resilient. And I'm going to put an image up. There's an image up on the screen that I want you to just take a look at for a moment. And as you see that image, I want you to engage me in the chat a little bit. What are some things that you notice about this particular image? You're going to have to talk to me in the chat a few times today. What are some things that you notice about this image? New growth. Thank you, Susan. New growth. Yeah. What else? What are some things you notice? It's hopeful, even though it's tiny. I love it. I love it. Here that they're coming in. It's found in a crevice. Where is it growing from? Right. Where is the root? It doesn't look like it's in a situation where it should even be able to grow. I see somebody said growth can happen. Thank you, Amanda. Growth can happen even in hard times. Oh, man. Nicole, you speak in my language. What you see with that picture is breakthrough. Scott notices that the sun is shining. It's hopeful, though it's tiny. It doesn't have to be a huge tree. This is great. This is great. We can keep on going with determination, growth in difficult places, small but mighty, overcoming adversity, harsh environment. There's nothing else like the plant. Oh, see, you all are deep. Good, good. Peaceful. And I know we'll keep getting these, and good. Keep on putting them in the chat. We want to keep on seeing these, but you all nailed it. This thing is growing in a place and in a context where it doesn't look like it should be able to grow. This thing, some sort of a way, and we don't know how, We don't know what it is attached to at the root. Where in the world is it coming from? But it has broken through the hardness of the soil, of the environment with which it's in some kind of way. We don't know how, we don't know what is aiding it, we don't know where its water source is coming from, we don't know if someone is taking care of it, we don't know how this is happening, but some kind of a way this thing has broken through and it is growing even in adverse environments. And that, my friends, is the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have to learn how to grow and how to be resilient, even in some contexts that have not been the perfect pasture. And I say often what we are doing is the work of tilling the ground. We are every day in our work as DEI practitioners working to get the soil ready for breakthrough, to get the soil ready for growth. And so when we think of what it is to be resilient, is recovering readily from adversity, from depression or the like. To be resilient is to be bouncy or elastic, to rebound readily. The property of a material to absorb energy, look at that one, when it is deformed elastically, and then upon unloading to have this energy recovered. The ability to weather tribulation without cracking. And then finally, it is the positive capacity to cope with stress and to bounce back to homeostasis after a disruption, And so, as we're thinking about what it means to be resilient in the work of DEI, we have to find a way, even when we're tired, even when we feel like we're facing resistance, even when we feel like it's really not wanted, it's not real at the organization that I'm serving, even when we begin to feel like I don't have much left, we have to find a way to keep on keeping on, to be resilient, to find a way to grow in spite of the challenges of the context that we are in. And so, as we continue to look at this, I want us to consider that sometimes the problem with being a DEI visionary, the problem with having DEI vision, sometimes it's that not everyone else can see the same things that we are seeing. The problem sometimes is that being a visionary is lonely. And now this begins to translate even beyond the scope of DEI visioning. This is even as a leader in general. There's crossover with these themes. One of the problems with having a vision, one of the problems with being a visionary is that what we're seeing, what we envision, it seems so obvious. And you begin to ask yourself, well, why doesn't everybody see this? Why doesn't everybody want to do this? And we begin to think that maybe something's wrong with these people who I'm working with, because the things that I'm presenting to them, they seem so elementary and they seem so simplistic to me, but yet and still it seems like it's a foreign topic, something that they cannot even begin to understand for those who I'm trying to get on board with my DEI efforts. It seems so obvious. And I talk a lot about like the Gallup Strengths tool and our strengths, or what we are good at, what we know very well. Our strengths become our lens. And so we think, well, yeah, it's not anything special about me. Everybody has to understand this. Everybody should see this. But I'm here to tell you today, as a practitioner who's been doing this work for about 20 years, not everybody sees what you believe to be obvious as obvious. For some, this is a brand new paradigm. And in order to keep your composure, in order to keep your momentum, you have to begin to find people where they are and bring them along with you. And so I want to do a little exercise. Many of you who I've worked with may have heard a couple of the exercises I'll do today before, but that's okay. You'll be all right. And so what I want you to do is in the chat, if you can, I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of math today. And I'm going to just simply, it's not anything too difficult. I'm just going to ask you to add some numbers. And I'm sure with the number of degrees and the prestigious people who are in this room, the department heads of Metro, the community leaders who are engaging us, that we can surely add. And so let me ask you this. I'm going to ask you a couple problems. I just want you to put the answer in chat as it comes to you. All right. So the first one is, let's look at what is 1,000 plus 40. I'll give it time. All right, good. Plus 1,000. Good. Plus 30. Good. Plus 1,000. Good. Plus 20. Good. Plus 1,000. Good. Plus 10. Uh-oh. 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 I'm seeing some differences of opinion. Okay, some of you all are like, no, okay, I got it now. The answer is not 5,000. The answer is 4,100. Now, with all of the knowledge, the intellection, and the depths of understanding of complex mathematic equations that exist within this particular realm and in this room, I am quite sure that you know how to add plus 10. But what happened? What happened is that I began to pull you in to a pattern. I began to pull you. Somebody said math is not my specialty. Yeah, I understand, but you can do plus 10. I'm pretty sure of it. But I began to pull you into a pattern. And what happens when you begin to fall into a pattern is that your mind actually stops thinking. Your mind stops processing, and you just let an automatic reaction or an automatic action or an automatic response begin to come forth. And sometimes, even though you know how to do it, you still get it wrong. And so Timothy talked about this hospitality. What's the term? I'm losing the exact term. This radical hospitality. And the fact of the matter, you all talked about how in the South. I'm not from the South. I've been here about 7 years, but there is a sense in the South of this concept, this conceptual understanding, theoretical idea of Southern hospitality, right? And we talked about the underside of that and how it sometimes doesn't go how you would like it to go. But let's just, for a level of understanding, just begin to agree that what happens is that sometimes we know how to be hospitable. But when we begin to fall into certain patterns of behavior, when we get around our particular work group, when we get back into the tyranny of the urgent that our job and the demands and pressures of life begin to pull on us, sometimes we begin to mess up when all we really had to do was add 10, and we shout out 5,000 instead of 4,100, And so we begin to fall into a pattern. And I want to challenge you today during our time that you begin to take the challenge of breaking the patterns of not thinking, so that we actually begin to fall into a place of being intentional about how we will be radically hospitable, being intentional about how we will make sure that we are actually practicing these tenets and this understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have it in the theoretical, but sometimes we fail to move it into the practical. And so it's one thing to know, but it's another thing to do. But the problem with our DEI vision is that many times not everyone can see it, and being a visionary is lonely. And so I wanted to just pause real quick and to go through this quick little list with you. You know you're a DEI visionary if you see diversity, equity, and inclusion differently than almost everybody around you. You know you're a DEI visionary if you have a unique perspective. In other words, other people don't see it the same way that you see it. You see solutions where others see problems. You see problems with others' solutions. You know you're a DEI visionary if you quickly know when you're headed in the wrong direction. You know you are a DEI visionary if you are often misunderstood. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands or for the emoji responses, but how many of you sometimes when you begin talking about diversity, whether that be race or sexuality or gender or age or whatever it may be, yeah, I will ask if you want to just use an emoji. How many of you often feel like you're misunderstood? I see before I even ask the question, people are like, I got both hands raised. You're often misunderstood. And here's the last one that I really want to point to. If you are a DEI visionary, the truth of the matter is that you make everybody uncomfortable. People who look like you get uncomfortable because they feel like you're being too welcoming to other people, and that you're not dwelling on things that are historic harms. And so you are invited to the dinner table, even though you are talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But then you make people who don't look like you uncomfortable because they feel like you're about to attack them, or this is about to become the beat up particular demographic situation. So here, be encouraged, be in good comfort. If you're making everybody uncomfortable, it could be because you are a visionary. And so I want to encourage you today to recognize that your vision is your value. Your vision is your value. And what do I mean by that? You are supposed to see differently. If you are leading anything, you have to be able to see something that other people are not seeing in order to begin to move your organization, or to move those who are following you, or to move your family, or to move yourself into a new place, into a pioneering place, into an uncharted territory. You have to see differently. You have to see something that not everyone else is seeing. Not only do you are needed to see differently if you are a visionary. Your vision is your value. Visionaries have the superpower of seeing the possibilities. Everybody, if you would, just type this in here. I see what could be. Come on, type that in the chat. I need you to work with me today. I see what could be. The problem with many of us is that we spend a lot of time focusing only on what has been. But if you are a visionary, you cannot get stuck. I'm not saying to ignore it. We need it. We talked about it at the beginning of this session on purpose, but we cannot allow ourselves to get stuck on what has been if we are really intentionally, seriously committed to moving forward to what could be. I'm ready to move to what could be. If you are a DEI visionary, you have to be able to not forget the rear view lens, but to focus most on the windshield that's in front of you, and begin to move your organization, to move your people, but also, as Tasneem said, to move yourself forward to what could be. I see what could be. All right. And so the path to becoming more resilient, the path to DEI resiliency, is that you have to bring others along with you. The challenge with that is that everyone is at a different place on their DEI journey. And in order to bring people along with you, you have to be both comfortable and patient with bringing somebody who's way behind up to where you are. It does no good to try to take your organization to level 10 if everybody is really actually functioning on level 1. So what do you have to do to bring others along? You have to lay out a very clear vision. Not only a clear vision, but you have to break that vision down into manageable chunks and share the vision in a way that inspires people to want to go where you're trying to go, to want to understand what you know. It's one thing to have a bunch of theoretical knowledge and understanding, but your theoretical knowledge and understanding doesn't mean anything if nobody cares. And so you have to share the vision in a way that inspires people to say, I want to go where she's taking me. I want to be where he's trying to get us. And when you can do that, you can begin to generate the most powerful tool that you will ever have in DEI work, and that is momentum. So as you share the vision, you are sharing it in a manageable way that shows people the wonderful nature of what could be. What could be if we were to really get on this train toward DEI. And so another thing that's important on the path to becoming resilient in the work of DEI is that you have to see and celebrate all forward progress. This is one of the biggest challenges that I begin to see as we try to do this work of DEI, is that we don't celebrate the small victories. When something good happens, we just hurry up and move on to the next thing because of the tyranny of the urgent, and because we are so desperate to get to our end goal, and we make a mistake of not stopping and celebrating the small victories. It is the celebrations of the small victories that will keep you resilient. It is the celebrations of someone coming from level 1 to level 2, even though you're trying to get them to level 25, that will keep you inspired to keep on going and to keep on keeping on, even when the system, the context, the powers that be, the resources are limited, the leaders don't want to do what we're asking them to do. The only thing that will keep you inspired and motivated to keep on going is if you see and celebrate all forward progress. All right. And so lay out your vision and your strategy. Here's a few questions for you. I'm doing the big picture. Dr. Patel is going to come and give us some detailed, thorough stuff about how data begins to impact our DEI vision. But I want to do some of the big picture stuff. And so there are some questions for you to answer. There's some questions for you to think about, not just in this time that we have together, but take these away and think of these even in your own life. Take a picture of this screen, take a screenshot, whatever you got to do. But here's 5 questions that I want you to begin asking yourself as you think about creating, implementing, and actualizing a DEI vision and strategy. What do you see as ideal as it relates to DEI vision? What this question does is it begins to answer the question, where are you trying to go? Like, what is it? What would be great? Many times we get so hung up on what has been that we don't know what could be. We're not really focused on what could be. We're looking backwards instead of looking forward. And we don't even know, like, how do we know if we're successful? What do you see as ideal as it relates to DEI vision? Secondly, what changes need to be made to get there? What do I need to adjust to get where I'm going? Number 3, who needs to buy in? Is there a particular person at the organization? Is there someone who has great influence that may be on the entry level of the organization who can begin to be glue and pull other people into the vision? Are there people in leadership that you really need them to understand what you're trying to do? And they will be your greatest advocate if you can help them to understand where you're trying to go and how where you're trying to go will help them. Who needs to buy in? Number 4, how will you get that buy-in that you need? What is it that you need to do? Who do you need to take to lunch? Who do you need to have a special conversation with? Who do you need to give affirmation to? Who do you need to show the benefits of doing the work? How will you get the buy-in that you need from those who you need the buy-in from? And number 5, how will you know you have succeeded? How will you know that your vision is working? How will you know? What will it look like? Here's a dreamy question for you. What will your DEI goals look like when they're achieved? How will you know? What will it look like for you to really get what you're trying to get to be accomplished and actualized in your organization? All right. These are questions for you. Again, take a screenshot, write those down. That's your homework. I'm always going to give homework. That's your homework. Keep on working through these questions, and it will begin to build for you a vision and a strategy for DEI. All right. All right. We got to do some more math because you all needed a little assistance. You needed some help on that first one. And so we're going to do one more thing. All right. Let me try this with you. Here's what I'd like for you to do. And you don't have to do this one in the chat. Matter of fact, don't. Do this one in your head. I'd like for you to pick a number between 2 and 10. Pick a number between 2 and 10. I know you can handle that. We're okay. All right. Multiply that number by 9. Multiply that number by 9. All right. Now you have that number. The product or the answer to your multiplication problem is now a 2-digit product, right? What I'd like for you to do is add the 2 digits of that product together. You guys stay with me. Come on, it's a lot of instructions. All right, you added the 2 digits of the product together. You have a number. Now I'd like for you to subtract 5 from the number that you have now. All right, subtract 5 from the number that you have. You have a new number. All right, that new number, what I'd like for you to do is to pick the corresponding letter of the alphabet that goes with it. So 1 is A, 2 is B, 3 is C, 4 is D, 26 is Z. You get it, right? So now you have a letter, right? You have a letter. And what I'd like for you to do is to think of a country that begins with that letter. All right, come on, you can do this. You can do this. Think of a country that begins with that letter. You got your country? You got your country? Good, good. All right. And so now what I'd like for you to do is don't put it in the chat. Don't put it in the chat. What I'd like for you to do is to take the second letter of your country. All right. And I'd like for you to think of an animal that begins with that letter. An animal that begins with it. You got it? All right. All right. And so Elizabeth gave away hers, and I think that she's on the right track. How many of you, by show of hands, emoji or chat, whatever, are thinking of an elephant in Denmark? How many of you are thinking of an elephant in Denmark? Somebody's like, me, right? A lot of you, right? Look at that. A lot of you are thinking of an elephant in Denmark. Not everybody, but a lot of you are thinking of an elephant in Denmark. Now, if you aren't, then you either pick some random country or some question about your math skills. But what I'm seeing in the chat is that a lot of you are thinking about an elephant in Denmark. Dance, puppets, dance, right? No, I am not a puppet master. I am not a magician. What happened is that I controlled a jackal, and whoa, my goodness, an ostrich in the Dominican Republic. Yeah, see, you have thought of some different country. That's good. But most of you thought of an elephant in Denmark. Why? The answer to that question is because what happened is that I controlled a lot of the inputs. All right. I controlled so many of the inputs that I was able to influence the outcomes. As a visionary in the work of DEI or in the work of anything that you're doing, the more inputs you can begin to control or impact, the more you can begin to impact your outcomes, right? That's so funny, an ostrich in the Dominican Republic. So the more inputs that you can control, the more outcomes you can influence. This is important. This is an important concept because what happens in the work of DEI is many times we become really frustrated about things we cannot control. But there are enough things that we can control where we could begin to impact the outcomes that we are working toward, right? And so, no, you may not have unlimited budget, but you can use the budget that you do have in a strategic way to produce the best outcomes that you possibly can. No, you cannot control every hiring decision. Perhaps you can begin to impact the dynamics and the composition and the demographics of the search committee, right? So we can either become frustrated with what we don't have control of, or we can begin to control as many of the dynamics that we can in order to get to the outcomes that I spoke the budget term, in order to get to the outcomes that we are attempting to get to. Instead, I want to challenge you, instead of spending your time complaining about the system or complaining about the parts of the system that you can't control, control what you can control. Control what you can control. All right. And so don't allow resistance to your DEI vision to kill your resilience. Don't allow resistance to kill your resilience. We begin to keep that focus of what has been versus what could be, and that gives us balance. We don't forget about what has been. We need to balance it with what could be. Where we have been should begin to be a building block for where we are going. Baldwin said we have to learn from our history. We have to learn from our past so that we can use it, so that we can use what we have learned. We can learn the wisdom we have gained in our context to begin to drive us, controlling the things that we can control, into the vision that we have, the place that we want to go, the place that we are trying to be. New objectives require new approaches. One of the statements I say all the time to people is that two things can be true at the same time. And so it can be true that your organization wants to move forward in DEI and that your organization does not want to move forward in DEI. Both of those statements can be true. It can be true that your organization really wants to move forward, but your organization can also really want to stay the same. Two things can be true. Sometimes we need to move from either or thinking to both and we get so frustrated because we're like, why do they keep saying they want to move forward? But then they show me that they don't. Yup, both things are true. And so as a visionary, you have to take the parts that work for you, control what you can control, and begin to move into what could be. Now, some of us, we just try to move forward no matter what. Some of us just try to change just to change. That doesn't work either. And then others of us are change averse or change resistant. What we have to do is begin to find a balance between what has been and what could be. All right. The other thing I want to encourage you to do is to break your vision, your DEI vision and strategy down into manageable chunks. So you're going to answer those questions that you wrote down or that you screenshotted before. But I want you also to, as you begin to get answers to those questions, you're forming a vision. And so what I want you to then begin to think of is your timeline. What can be accomplished very soon? What can be accomplished in the next 1 to 3 months? What can be accomplished in the next 3 to 6 months? What can be accomplished in the next 6 to 12 months? What happens in year 2? What happens in year 3, and so on and so on, and begin to build your vision out. Many times we try to do it all in one effort. Like when we get done delivering this training across the organization, we're going to be good. We're gonna be at a different level of functionality, and the frustration comes in because it does not work that way. And so we have to begin to break it down into chunks so that we have somewhere to keep going every step, getting us to the place of actualized vision. Organizations have to ask the question, what should we keep and what should we change? And we also must ask, can we remain relevant without evolving? And I'm here to tell you that no organization can remain relevant without evolving. All right. And so when I talk about breaking down the vision, one of the things that our department heads know, as I've talked to you all so far in some of our talks and the departments that we've worked with, is that a big part of like my DEI vision strategy is lens development for department heads. And I'm starting with this manageable chunk. This is just an example. I'm trying to get our department heads to recognize the differences and the needs for normalizing difference, recognizing that, you know, there are people who see the world differently than me. And I know this seems elementary to some of us. There are people who think differently than me. There are people who have different perspectives than me. What I believe to be true is not the same shared truth that everyone may have. So let's just get us to the point first in our lens development of normalizing that difference exists. And then we're going to begin to try to move to the next phase, which is valuing difference. Now that I know that people see the world differently than me based on a wide variety, a whole gamut of protected class situations, backgrounds, ethnicities, experiences, communication styles. Now that I know that people see the world differently than me, I then now begin to move into the phase of valuing different perspectives, recognizing that if I get somebody who sees the world different than me on my team, then what happens is I've expanded the reach of my vision. Oh my goodness. And then finally, once I see that people see different than me, I value that difference, then it begins to move us, hopefully, as a department, as an institution, as a hiring manager, as an individual, into seeking difference. In my individual relationships, I need somebody who sees what I don't see. Otherwise, my blind spots will lead me into a wall. In my organizational relationships, I need someone who sees differently than I see, so that I can make sure that I'm truly being inclusive in my leadership decisions. I'm truly being inclusive in my hiring choices, that I'm truly being inclusive in my agendas and objectives. And so as a part of my DEI vision strategy, I have to begin to break this thing down into chunks, and then we can begin to celebrate every time we see an example. Okay, that person just normalized difference. Okay, now they've moved into valuing difference. Oh, great, now they're moving into seeking difference. But it requires for us to break our vision down into manageable chunks. We talked about the importance of sharing the DEI vision. We have to get to a place where we're connecting, where we're inspiring, where we're challenging, and where we're motivating. As we share the DEI vision, people won't follow you if they don't know where you're going. People won't follow you if they don't know where you're going. So you have to connect with people. You have to build trust with people. You have to present yourself, and this is for DEI workers, present yourself as a resource rather than a threat. I got to take the slide down and emphasize that. Present yourself to the people who you are working with as a resource rather than a threat. Show them what they get out of working with you. Build that trust. If people see you see DEI as a hammer, then it depends on what kind of hammer. A hammer can either be used as a weapon or a tool, right? So you have to present yourself as a resource. My question for you is, how are you wielding DEI? You have to inspire. Paint that picture of what could be. I tell people all the time, look, hey, we are trying to do something really cool. I'd love to partner with you to build something really cool as it relates to DEI. We're doing some groundbreaking work, and I'd love for you to be a part of this. We are trying to move ourselves organizationally into a space that we have never been in before. All of this is inviting. All of this is motivating. All of this makes people say, where are we going? How can I help? I want to be on board. What do we need to do to make it happen? Present yourself as a resource. All right. So here, I know some of you are like, I've tried that and it didn't work. All right. Here's what I want you to do wherever you are. I wish I could see your cameras right now, but I'm not worried about it. I'm going to trust that you're really going to do this. I'd like for you to lift your hands as high as you can. All right. You got them lifted as high as you can. All right. Now what I'd like for you to do is lift them a little bit higher. Invariably, as I do this in person with people, you can put your hands down. When I do this in person with people, what happens is that everybody is always able to lift those hands a little bit higher. Now, that means you failed on the first assignment that I gave you when I said lift your hands as high as you can. We always hold back just a little bit. There's always a little bit more that we can do. There's always a little further forward that we can go. All right. And so what I'm going to challenge you, even when you begin to face resistance, the way that you don't allow your resistance to kill your resilience is that you find another way. Find it. I wish you would type that. Come on, you got to type it in the chat. Find another way. I know you've run into resistance. I know that people told you no. I know that people don't seem like they're on board with the efforts. I know people are talking, saying one thing and doing another thing, and they're beginning to feel like hypocrites, and you're tired of your whole organization right now. But I want you to lift your hands a little bit higher. The challenge is set attainable goals. Check in on the progress of those goals, celebrate the achievement of the goals, find out what moves people to action, and provide motivation. Provide motivation. All right. I'm almost ready to wrap up, but here we go. Let me see. Share the vision. So in order to share the vision, you have to share what should be, what could be, what role can they play, and what's the prize? What should be, what could be, what role can they play, and what's the prize? As you're sharing the vision, as you're trying to get that person on board to be an ally, to be an advocate, to be a change agent, what you have to do is begin to share with them. If you're the DEI visionary, share with them what should be. And let me pause and parenthetically say that all of us should be DEI visionaries. Even if you're the director of a division that in your mind doesn't have anything to do with DEI, there is not an area of any institution that does not have anything to do with DEI. I say this to people all the time. If you are not a good leader of diversity, equity, and inclusion, you are not a good leader. Because how can you lead people and motivate people and inspire people if you don't know and understand the similarities and the differences that exist between you? If you are not a good leader of diversity, equity, and inclusion, you are not a good leader. All right. I know that didn't just inspire you and motivate you, but what you need to do is to share what should be if you want to get them on board. Here's what should be. Here's what could be. These are the possibilities. Here's the role that you can play. And finally, you have to share with people what's the prize. What will you gain from doing this work? How will your team be better? How will your sales be better? How will your reputation be better? What is the win? What will the prize be if you participate in this work of DEI? And so that's why we have to see and celebrate all forward progress. How do we do that? First of all, this statement is very true at the top. There's no such thing as a small DEI victory. There's no such thing. There's no such thing as a small DEI win. Any win in the space of DEI is a big win. And so what do we need to do? We need to show and highlight every piece of progress that we make. Show the effectiveness of your programs. Share testimony. Show the impact on morale. Show the impact on the bottom line. Show the impact on your customers and your constituents. Provide both quantitative and qualitative data that Dr. Patel is going to talk to us about in a few minutes. And then even provide awards and recognition as means of positive reinforcement to show that this thing is important. This thing is working. Celebrate every victory. Celebrate even the small victories, and be reminded of this whole picture that we started with today. What you're attempting to do is to grow sometimes in environments that don't seem like they're conducive for growth. And so if it doesn't seem like this is an easy place to grow, find another way. Find another strategy. Find out what needs to change in order to become, instead of focusing on what could be, to begin to focus on, instead of focusing on what has been, to focus on what could be. I challenge you to remain resilient in the face of the pressure of doing DEI work, in the face of the reality that not everybody is on board with what you're trying to do. I know I'm talking to those who are about it today because you signed up to give half of your day away to talk about DEI. So I'm just going to choose to believe. I know we're all at different places, but I'm going to choose to believe that there is something within you that cares about making progress in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. My challenge to you is remain resilient. Don't let resistance kill your resilience, and keep on finding a way to move into what could be as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The last thing I'm going to share with you as I end with this. It's a poem by James Patrick Kinney that was written in the 1960s, and it's called The Cold Within. 6 humans trapped in happenstance, in dark and bitter cold. Each one possessed a stick of wood, or so the stories told. Their dying fire in need of logs, the first woman held hers back, for of the faces around the fire, she noticed one was black. The next man looking across the way saw not one of his church, and couldn't bring himself to give the fire his stick of birch. The third one sat in tattered clothes, he gave his coat a hitch. Why should his log be put to use to warm the idle rich? The rich man just sat back and thought of the wealth he had in store, and how to keep what he had earned from the lazy, shiftless poor. And how from the lazy, shiftless poor, the black man's face bespoke revenge as the fire passed from sight. For all he saw in his stick of wood was a chance to spite the white. The last man of this forlorn group did naught except for gain. Giving only to those who gave was how he played the game. The logs held tight in death's still hands was proof of human sin. They didn't die from the cold without. They died from the cold within. Thank you.
Welcome everyone back. I see most of our participants have been able to stay with us, and that's a little bit pleasing to me, given that we're going to end on data, which might not always seem as exciting as other parts. But part of the session today is I'm hoping to educate and learn from each other about the role of data and how we can use it to set, execute, and evaluate our DEL goals for any department in strategic planning and assessment, and as well as some of the opportunities and obstacles we can find to being data-centric. So this session will hopefully lay the groundwork to cultivate discussion, collaboration, and even integration among our data practitioners and consumers across Metro. Ultimately, the aim of this session isn't really supposed to be unidirectional flow of information, just me talking with slides, but I'm hoping it's going to be more dialogue. And in the end, if I'm speaking the least, that's going to be a great session. The idea behind us forming this community practice for DEI within Metro is that it's a place for us to exchange information, but also problem solve. And that happens when you start to bring together practitioners of different levels of experience, of different levels of expertise, when we have those with different skill sets or even different resources, and ultimately those who have a shared interest in leveraging data collection and analysis to improve service delivery. We're going to start by setting the ground rules. And if you remember from the first session, Andrea went over what are some of the things that can help us facilitate this session, but also in a community of practice, what are some good ground rules to think of? So recognizing who's in the room, acknowledging your own shortfalls and biases. We don't want to blame, and that's important to setting up situations of trust and both respect, and also understanding each's individual experiences, and also sharing there. So in this session, I'm going to rely on a few different options that you've already all used to be able to communicate. Of course, we have the chat where you all can post any ideas you have or questions or comments that you have. Of course, if you'd like to speak, you can use the raise hand function and we'd be happy to unmute you and let you speak there as well. And we're also going to be instituting a few little tools that are fun to WebEx, such as polls. So I actually want to start with one of those. And we're going to open a poll right now. And I want to just hear who's in the room. How do you all view yourselves as people who use, consume, maybe understand or don't understand data? And feel free to mark more than one option and submit your answers. You've got about 30 seconds to make your choice. Okay, I see about half of you are answered. Still some time to make a decision. On the mobile, it's a little bit trickier, so I understand if we don't have 100% participation. But we're going to share. So you should be able to see the results now. See, we've got a good mix of different kind of data practitioners here. So those who think that data is central to the work, a lot of people who are interested in learning more about data that we have at Metro and what's available for others. People also looking to collaborate with projects. So talk about how we can leverage our data skill and knowledge to walk together. And the people who are also interested in just learning about the role that data can play in your DEI work. So one of the things that Andrea, Razel, and all of our teams talked about is the importance of alignment. And so when you're thinking maybe about the sessions, there was an actual logical flow from where we started with Andrea, we went to Razel, and then you ended to now here with talking about data. So our first session really talked about how through our panelists, we got to hear questions about what it's like to enter the DEI space and what some of us as individuals need to do to be able to work and prepare yourselves for working in that area, but also what are some of the realities, and you can learn from that. In session 2, we recognize that sometimes acting as a change agent in the DEI space plays a pivotal role, not only recognizing and characterizing disparities highlighted in the first session, but it can also lay the foundation for how we create, launch, and assess the DEI vision. And I want to make a quick plug for one of the programs that's going to be rolled out soon, which is a set of conscious inclusion and unconscious bias trainings for Metro leaders and employees that's going to be offered out soon. And if you're a Metro employee and you're interested in being trained to deliver this training, you can send, the Razel. So I just saw from the poll that not everyone was able to see the results, but okay, I'll tell you. So for those of you, we have about 71 participants here. About 28% of you, so 20 people, said that data is central to your work. About 31% said that you were interested in learning more about the kind of data that we have in Metro and what you can do with it. 21% were interested in how to collaborate with others on DEI projects. And about 37% of you said that you wanted to learn more about the role of DEI. So we've seen a lot of almost equal interest in each of those 4 areas. So thank you for letting me know that in the chat. See, community of practice already at work. So before we get going back to alignment a little bit, I wasn't planning on starting with a quote, but since our other 2 session facilitators brought in one, I thought I'd bring in one that's a little bit more cheeky. And the quote is from an economist who said, if you torture the data long enough, it will confess to anything. And part of the reason why I chose that quote is I think if you look at any organization's website, any institution, you're going to see the word data-driven there as an approach that's embraced or a way to describe the practices they have. But when I hear that question, when I hear those words data-driven, my first thought comes to mind, well, what exactly does that mean? Data is probably, it's being described now as the new oil, right? Everyone knows that it's important. There's so much out there, but do we all have the same shared understanding of what that means and how to best utilize data? So I'm going to start with just a few definitions of what we mean when we talk about data and how that can help you to elevate and realize your DEI visions. So take a look at the image that I have before you. So you can see 3 linked but not synonymous analytical terms that you'll often see with data. So their first is data at the base. Next, you'll see information, insights, and a very small triangle at the top that we'll talk about. So simply put, if we're talking about data, that's all the raw and unprocessed facts that we have, usually in the form of numbers or text. Data can be quantitative, and as Razel brought up in the last session as well, it can be qualitative. So those are things that we see that can be measured or observed. So data are typically stored in databases, those spreadsheets, even surveys or field notes, and they provide the basis to help us generate information and develop further insights. So information is different from data. Information is that prepared data that has been processed, aggregated, and organized into more consumable formats, such as visualizations, reports, or dashboards. Think about your pie charts, your line charts, those things that tell you what's the percentage breakdown of things, what are trends over time. So these presentations help to make the context for some of these summaries, so helping to understand when you see change. Are we talking about monthly, weekly, or yearly? And they also help save time for the viewer, the consumer, who might not just have the capacity to parse through all of the individual data points you have to get to a certain understanding of it. Now, data and information further set the stage to formulate insights that can influence decisions and help drive change. Insights are generated by analyzing information and drawing conclusions. Data and information are meant to explain what happened, while insights focus on the why. And not all insights will lead to change in practices or actions. So in just a survey of a lot of different organizations and corporations, well, they said that data was something important to driving their practices. Only less than 30% found that it was actually helping them to achieve the goal. So what you need to understand is how data and information are going to help you lead to insights. And so when we talked a little bit, I referenced that small triangle at the top. It's only a small portion because those are what we call our actionable insights. And those are tied in with goals and strategy. If an insight doesn't properly help you explain something that occurred, it's not yet an actual insight. So valuable insights are those that are going to lead to action as opposed to simply answer a question. So part of the reason why I wanted to show this image with you all is just the idea that data is a tool and not necessarily the answer to how you're going to realize your DEI vision. How does that same process help to us actually realize the DEI vision? For one thing, the right data can help and information can help us to understand whether we have equitable and not equal practices and policies. So one stumbling block that seems to keep repeating itself when it comes to embracing an equity-based approach is understanding not only what's the difference between equality and equity, but why we've moved from talking about equality to equity. Let's just start with basic definitions. It helps to think of equity as both a process and an outcome. Equity within government refers to fair practices and policies that ensure everyone has access to the same opportunities. In order to do so, equity acknowledges and addresses past and present structural inequities that advantage some over others. Equality is one of the central principles of our democracy and is based on the belief that all people should have the same opportunities and treated the same regardless of differences. That principle has guided efforts to create non-discriminatory laws, policies, and practices. Equality does not preclude the recognition of past harms or inequities, but it does not centralize it to the extent that equity does. Both equity and equality then tend to color our vision of what's fair. What is fairness? And it's important when any organization that you have alignment on what these terms mean, and data can help create shared definitions and characteristics of what that fairness is going to look like. So a little context for what that transition from equality versus equity, because I think looking at some of the historical reasons behind why we do things understands why certain traditions persist, but also where certain traditions need to be changed. So the principle of equality really gained importance in public management in the US in the early 1900s. And this is right near the end of a period that probably a lot of you know about, the Gilded Age. Now, this was a time of rapid economic growth and industrialization. We also see these massive waves of immigration coming to both the east and western coasts of the continental US. At the same time, this is also a period that was classified as being one of rampant political corruption, a widening wealth gap that also came about because it was so easy for corporations and individuals, frankly, to bribe those who were used to shape government policies. And that period of corruption and favoritism gave rise to a movement for equal treatment and access to resources. That aspiration for equality is evident in several of our country's political movements that fought for equal and explicit access to civil rights, such as the right to vote, the right to marry, and the right to housing. But despite these legal protection, disparities continue to exist, and in some cases even increase, leading many to favor an equity as a guiding principle over that of equality. Now, within local government, we might actually see equity and equality in practice in our own data play out differently. Think of any of your organizations, and feel free to put that in the chat too, if you can think of the federal regulations, the professional standards, local laws that dictate services and resources cannot be denied to anyone because of resources based on race, national origin, different religion, physical abilities. An equity-based approach will uphold that idea, but also ask, how are you going to ensure equal access to those services and resources, and identifying any barriers or opportunities that are present for different groups? The process for enacting quality-based programs versus equity-based programs is also different. So I want you all to take an image of two maps that we have created by our ITS department here at Metro that showcases the spatial distribution of our population on the right and the percent of households without a vehicle on the left. So the darker portions are those where you're going to see a higher percentage of people for the population density, and the same as in the pink. Those darker grays and sort of purplish colors are going to where you see the households with the highest percentage of households with no vehicle. Let's talk about what would happen if we were going to take an equality approach or an equity-based approach using both of these images. So say we were going to equally distribute a resource across Metro. Each tract on that map, whether it's darker or a light color, would have the same amount of resources as its neighbors. You wouldn't see clusters of projects in one area versus another. The process is pretty straightforward. Everybody gets the same thing. Every geographic location gets the same. Resources are spread out evenly across the county. But what I would invite some of you in the chat, and even if you'd like to speak to complicate this process, is how might we conceive of equal distribution of resources when we account for population distribution? So when we talk about equally distributing something, are we talking about per person? Or are we talking about per zip code? Or are we talking about just geographic space? Move on to the map on the left. Let's say an equity-based approach. We might consider for a particular program how that's going to be accessed by those who don't have access to readily to a vehicle or even public transportation. We might think that in one case that there are certain areas that are going to need more of a resource, or think about, again, those accessibility issues. What's interesting here too is if you think about these two different variables, things that impact our viewpoint of where things should go, there's not necessarily alignment between them. So the darker areas of places without a vehicle aren't necessarily places with the highest population as well. In terms of efficiency of process, we can see that there is immediately a difference in the equality-based approach versus the equity-based approach. So distributing things equally at the very most basic level is very efficient. An equity-based approach is more targeted and more variables to consider with what can make the process take longer. Let's think about outcomes though. What happens when we target resources to the areas where need is perceived as the most, or areas that have not seen the same level of investment in past? And there are situations where, in this case, equity is the most cost-effective approach rather than inequality. For example, roads become disproportionately more expensive to repair as conditions deteriorate past a certain point. An equitable approach prevents roads from reaching the point at which they become disproportionately expensive to repair. So in a way, we have almost a difference in both efficiency and prophecy or process, which could be an equality-based approach, versus efficiency and outcomes, which might center equity in that idea. Here's another example, a few more examples of what efficiency or examples of quality-based programs and policies versus examples of equity. So for instance, something that any city or government, probably organization, has to deal with at some point is a cut in budget. So you could do it where, in this example, the city cuts the budget for 25 community centers for all the centers, but at the same amount and at the same times. An equity approach might ask you how many communities actually need to use a community centers. For instance, how many people are they saying enter them? What is the level of organizations using that space, and reduce hours for centers that aren't used as frequently. Another way to think about it is when we do community meetings, are we setting up situations where those with different English abilities are going to be able to participate? Do we have the resources in place or the ability to hire translators or to attend those meetings or even offer the language in a different thing? What data would you use for the first example? Amanda, that is a great question. And that's actually, instead of answering it, I'd like to see first if anyone any of our participants would kind of want to guess for that, or put maybe their ideas for it. One way that might be simple is just first to ask, what's the data we're looking at, and breaking it down, Amanda. So we have 25 centers, right? We know we have to first figure out what are their hours of operation. I think I know, but I wasn't sure my train of thought is right. I'd like to hear it anyway if you feel open to share, because nice. Anyone have any suggestion for Amanda? Or Amanda, would you like to share? And maybe to encourage you all, I would like to say, for me, it would be polling and looking at data within each center. That is a great suggestion. Anybody else, maybe from some of our more tenured employees with Metro who probably had to face this situation? What are some of the practices or approaches that they've done to face a situation like this? So Amanda, actually, she's helping me out a little bit because she's actually talking about ways to look at not only quantitative and qualitative data. Oh, right, Parks is coming in. Director Odom said she agrees. You look at attendance at each center. So how many people are actually there? That's great. How many hours actually need to use their community centers? Also, one way that you can maybe further disaggregate that data, break it down a little bit, is when do you see the most attendance? Because if we're talking about hours of operation and maybe how to cut them, you want to think about when do you see the most? Is it after school? Are they weekends? Are we talking about evenings near the end of the week? You can see how that one little question, you can take one form of data and start to break it into other parts. Just really start to think about how you can target your approach to solving a problem that's going to affect everyone in the city. Great. Molly, also look at how much time people spend at any given time for which activities. Great. Okay. So we can also talk about in public schools. So for instance, that's maybe a different question there where we can talk about going directly to the source, right? The community centers. The last example, we're talking about public schools having computer labs and the same number of computers and hours, but maybe in the recognizing in other ways, like what data do we have about computer access, internet access at home, things that maybe we can find out from outside sources to talk about which schools might need more access to computers and access. So you can see there's a difference between the equality-based approach and the equity-based approach. For those of you who were part of Metro, And remember that last year in the budget equity tool, where we asked you all to think about the impact that your budget modifications were going to have in terms of enabling, or I would say maybe even inhibiting equity-based approach, we talked about the importance of data as well. So just to review what some of those questions are, we asked you about what were the data sources you could use or the indicators to talk about equity? What were some of the racial and economic data that you could use? And then we also asked you how to think about internally, what were the measures that you were going to use to talk about equity within the workplace? So for instance, how will your department use targeted data to help inform recruitment, retention, and promotion efforts? And in asking departments to be data different, we talked about several different kinds of specific forms of data that you can use. Let's see, social needs. So we talked about, of course, how you can use demographic data, social and economic indicators. We talked about disaggregated data and special data. And we emphasize this use of data as it helps to provide more insights into the extent impact of budget requests on both residents and employees. One of the things that we found in working with many departments is that you already use major data sets, such as the US Census Bureau's American Community Survey, in this way. But departments also utilize metrics, either industry standards, government regulated ones, or their own internally developed to start to talk about that. Yes, the budget equity tool is available on our website, so you can see it from last year, and we're going to be putting each edition on our website as well. In general, when we talk about data, though, let's break it down to, we're talking about two different kinds of data. But before I get into that, I want to bring up the idea of Razel brought up obstacles and thinking about all the different forms of data that we have in another poll. So what I want you all to do, and I will be sharing the results, so I missed that last time, is to talk about realistically, when we do with data, what are some of those obstacles that you all find when dealing with it? So some of the ones that I put up here were like time consuming. You don't necessarily have the staff dedicated for that data collection, or you're already reporting on so many metrics to several agencies that there's too much data to get through. You're not sure what are the factors you should be focusing on, which are the data points that you might not know as well. There's too little data, so you can't get people to respond to your surveys. They're not giving you the information you want, or you don't have the ability to collect data the way you need efficiently. We often talked about too, when we think about those large numbers, the statistics, what does that mean when people's lived experiences or their interactions with Metro don't reflect that? Specifically, what happens when our performance metrics don't match people's perceptions of what Metro's doing? And we also talk about multiple sources of data too. What can be difficult to access or reconcile when you're trying to mix together a bunch of different data systems, a lot of different variables. And of course, give the other option as well, that when in the chat, if there are situations that you can think of that come outside of them. One thing that I know is very common in previous work is that people are very often protective of data. So they don't necessarily want to share that. So sometimes getting access to that raw information to be able to process to, that's something I know personally that I've seen here. And one of the things I think, it looks like from our results, that we didn't have too many respondents, but the majority of you said that it is time consuming. So about 12% of you that responded, that there is multiple sources of data. That got a big response for, again, about 18% of you all saying there. The lived experience, it seems to be hitting with a lot of people that data does not reflect lived experience as well. Too little data was not that much, or too much data. So that's interesting that those 2 points don't have there as well. One of the reasons why I thought about where I would start to talk about this question is because when we say, again, all that data that's coming from there, there's all the potential for it, but I think recognizing sometimes issues that we have with accessing data can also be a problem. So data, when we also talk about data too, one of the things that Razel brought up was quantitative data and qualitative data. And I wanted to just present at least a definition of what those things are, because I think not only are there differences in what they are, but there's differences in what we think the utility of it is, and frankly, the validity is it. So data is just that more concrete thing. Data, it's measured in numerical values, but also think about some of the ways it can capture abstract ideas. So for instance, when you go to the doctor's office and they ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, how much pain are you feeling? I'm never really sure how to answer that question, but that's one way you can take something more abstract and turn it into something numerical. Quantitative data is great when you want to quantify or measure a problem. And it also tends to carry more confidence of you, that it's more objective than other forms of data. Think of the numbers don't lie. And substantive because you can get to larger sample sizes. Qualitative data is observed data that isn't necessarily expressed numerically, but it can involve case studies, ethnographies, interviews, and other forms of research that fall outside of that definition. So when we talk about qualitative data, we're also talking about qualities, patterns, and characteristics in descriptive form. One of the things I think that kind of throws people off about qualitative data is how to talk about it in a way that's easy to consume, because it is usually in longer texts or reports. But qualitative can also help us understand people's perceptions of services or on the ground things from there. It's getting more of an insider view of what we think of those things and what we're seeing of different phenomena and patterns. And just like qualitative data and quantitative data, there are restrictions to what makes a good sample set and what also makes something a methodology to it. So with qualitative data, if you're a little bit afraid about how to use it, here's some questions you can ask yourself. When you're taking a story for something or an interview, does that accurately describe what you've observed? Are your conclusions applicable in other contexts? Did you avoid bias in your analysis? And are your findings consistent and repeatable? So just like quantitative data, qualitative data can be set up to the same kind of rigor and I guess reproducibility that you can see from quantitative data that gives it as much threat. We also have historical data. Again, we've talked a lot about what these inequities come from. They don't just appear, they have there from there. And so that can help us to understand not only practices in government, but also some of the policies that we have. So to give an example of that, the city auditor of Portland, Oregon analyzed about 6 years of maintenance complaints for owner-occupied properties. When they did an analysis of the complaints and their outcomes, they saw that there were a disparate effect on the communities of color. And they were also happening in areas of high levels of gentrification. So you start to see a strong correlation between the numbers of complaints received and the median home price, adjusted population, and minutes to travel downtown. So that helped them to understand which factors were more likely to find areas where you're going to see high level complaints. At the same time, they were able to start to link together some of the practices that they'd seen in a cone with a longer history of what had happened not only in Portland, but in the state of Oregon. So they saw this hostility towards communities of color and exclusionary laws that tended to bar backsetters from coming in or remaining in Oregon. During this period, you see at the same time the city of Portland start to adopt property maintenance regulations and the use of a complaint-based system. So when the auditors know that those explicitly racist policy justifications have been removed, a lot of the underlying assumptions of what was livable, attractable, and safe neighborhoods stood the same. So that's one way we're understanding the historical context of why we do things can help to color our idea of what the data can mean. Here's a more innocuous example. So if you ever think about yard signs in America and why we have them, we usually associate them with ideas of civic beauty and even recreation, some property values, but yards were really important before we had any kind of public sewer system because people needed to be able to have wells and pools, cesspools, and have access to it. So that's something where the original idea of why we had mandated these certain kinds of regulation has changed over time when we see differences of infrastructure. So those are just two examples that used to pop out to me about when the historical context of knowing things can help as well. Okay. So we talked a little bit too, again, just more definitions of what data means. So disaggregated data, that was something that we just in practice within this session went through. So how do we take something as simple as attendance at community centers and start to break it down into smaller units? And typically when we're talking about equity-based work, we're asking you to look at data and how it impacts separate population groups. There's also indicator data, so that helps us understand who's faring well in our community and who isn't compared to the overall average. This will not necessarily be the same from city to city, and depending on the services, certain indicators may carry more importance than others. Shared opinions on what the indicators Metro needs to focus on in our data analysis can also help us better align our DEI efforts across the city and create more meaningful and substantial changes. Common indicators that you usually see people utilize to start to measure equity and access to opportunity are things like educational attainment, of course, race and ethnicity, transportation. So whether or not you have access to either a private vehicle, a ability to walk somewhere, or even access to public transportation. We also talked a little bit about spatial data, and this is one where I think it's very tricky when we talk about different data sets, is there's lots of ways to talk about space. So census tract is one that really helps us understand the kinds of indicator data we have because it's collected from an outside source. But we also think in terms of zip codes. We think in terms of neighborhoods. We've got city limits, especially for Davidson County, where we see cities kind of be part of our county, but also come to not. We've got council districts, we've got zones, so in terms of zoning, and we've also got corridors. So when we start to think about the city at a bigger space. So those are all the different kinds of ways that you can think about space and when you're talking about geographic duty as well. So that's a lot of data, and it's not really a conclusion. And part of that was the aim of the session was to get an opinion from you all about what Metro could be doing better, both as practitioners, as an organization, as individuals, to using data in our DEI work. And what I would like for you all to do in the chat is to start to think about how you answer this question is what can my department, team, or an individual do to improve data practices within Metro? What would you like to do? What do you think needs to be done? And what do you think Metro needs to do? So this is, and of course, if anyone would like to share out loud, we can have that as well, but we can start to think. So that's kind of where I wanted to set that up, because as a community of practice, the idea is that that information isn't just coming from me as an individual or even our DEI office, but how do we start to talk as a Metro-wide and even city-wide about how to leverage data across for everyone? So anyone can think about some of those ways. So what can those departments do? And if you'd like to speak and unmute, you can as well. Maybe start with something that's a little bit easier is what would we need? And one of the things that I would suggest is that just knowing what data is available is probably, I would say, who's got what data and what's there. And we have to do that. And I think there's a lot of people in the room who could probably help with that. But again, I'm interested to know from you all, what do you think you can do? What would you like to do? What needs to be done? And what does Metro have to do to support those goals? It's probably a lot to ask for you all to think in a few seconds, but I'm going to ask. Question, would love to have more tools, capacity, support, qualitative data collection. Great, thank you, Casey. I would say not even qualitative data collection, but maybe even analysis or an understanding on how to do that, right? We have a lot of different ways and approaches depending on our departments, our experience, our education that tells us how to do these things. So learning about the different methods would be helpful. Learning about maybe also, I think, who are those data practitioners within Metro? You know, I think we all live in small worlds, but we also live in a very large government process. So figuring out just what's out there and who's out there is going to be important. It's a big question, and it's probably going to be something that we can't answer in one session, but it's something I'd like you all to think about, not only when you're formulating your DEI strategy and thinking about how you're going to achieve your goals, but I think it's also important to start asking, what resources do you need and who can help you with those? So again, talking about working together and across fields and departments is very important. Cross-department collaboration. Would also like to know who's using an equity lens and data analysis. There we go. Thank you, Raquel. That's great. So we've seen a lot of people who are eager to start working across departments. And that's good. That's sort of what was the aim of a lot of these sessions and coming from that as well. Teams have space like this to share ideas and get feedback. Great. So I'm seeing a lot of good ideas in the chat, and we're going to go ahead. I'm going to stop my presentation now. Andrea Blackman would like to wrap up the final session. So Andrea, if you're ready, would you like to take over?
Thank you, Sneh, so much. I'm back. Thank you. Everyone, go ahead and put some emojis and give big claps to Dr. Patel and also Razel Jones and Tasneem and to Timothy. And I would be remiss if I did not give a big shout out and thank you to our tech AV person who has worked behind the scenes, who designed the flyer, who emailed you, and that is Michelle Boudreau. She has worked tirelessly behind the scenes. And Michelle, we know that we would not have been able to pull this off without you. So thank you so much for your work as well. This has served its purpose. Our goal was to bring a community together that we can begin conversations around how our jobs are impacted through history, how we need to understand that historic impact before we develop new policies. We also wanted to look at what is expected of me as a DEI practitioner and how do we leverage that with data. We have a few takeaways and some nuggets of wisdom that I just want to rattle off that I gleaned from this micro session today. Tasneem started off by asking us and reminding each of us that this work, this collective work must start with us. If we're going to have a collective impact, we must start with an individual impact. And then Timothy graciously told us that we must be radical. We must be radical in our hospitality. We must be radically showing up when we are listening to our communities, and our transformation must be done with radical intensity. Then Razel reminded each of us of how do we create a strategy and a vision for creating DEI practices? What is needed from us? And he also reminded us that we can't go, even though we feel as if we grow weary, that we must remain resilient if we are going to remain as a community of practice and those of us who are committed to making our city more equitable. And Sneh rounded it off with us by taking some time to say what would be the equity approach if we collectively were going to look at how we were distributing resources throughout our city. This has been an amazing first community of practice. I want to thank again all of our panelists and our presenters and our co-hosts, and thank each of you from joining us and taking time out of your day today. We know that you came hoping to glean some information, but as Sneh mentioned, you are the experts as well. So this is the first step. Today's convening was virtual. Our next one will be in person. So we're not going away. Razel said, if you need help with designing your vision, and that's what we're here to do. We have worked alongside many of you as department heads and elected officials, and we are here. Our office is here to continue to do that. We know that there are challenges that you have told us that you have seen that have persisted in our city. You have identified those pressing issues. You've listened to community members. We've listed some of them. Disinvestment, hypersegregation, our neighborhoods, public and private investments, hiring and retention of BIPOC talent, leadership accountability, and policies that no longer serve us. We have listened and we have heard you. And so each of us on our own journeys and our own ways, we will begin to identify our own personal biases, as Tasneem told us, look at our own personal preferences, our own habits, and consider how they have and contribute to an inequitable system. But Razel said we're not going to stay there. We're moving forward. And in order for us to do this, we must continue to normalize conversations and spaces like this within our city and within our government. This community of practice will help each of you do that, will help us do that. A better understanding. You can expect better understanding for peer accountability. And how do we implement these ideas throughout our city? Not everyone who is in attendance today works for Metro government. We have a lot of nonprofits that are with us. I saw Michael from Cummins that's with us. We are the community of practice. It is our job to move the needle forward. It is our job after the next 18 months and 18 years that we can boldly say and innovatively say that Nashville can and is a city that operates and is thriving and vibrant, but also equitable for all of our communities. And I'll leave you with the words of yet again, the great James Baldwin. James Baldwin reminds us that this challenge is in the moment, but the time is always now. And again, we thank you all so much for sharing space with us today. And if you would be so kind as to put in the chat, when we leave these spaces, we ask everyone to tell us how you are leaving this space. So go ahead and put it in chat. How do you leave this space? Some of you entered with anxiety, some of you entered with anticipation. How are you leaving this space? And I want to give one last plug before we go. Thank you, Michelle, for being inspired. One last plug for, don't forget, if you want to be a part of a trainer for the unconscious bias that Razel mentioned, and Razel already got an email from someone who's already in attendance. LaTanya has already reached out to us. Thank you, Michaela. I'm glad that you're leaving refreshed, fired up, and ready to go. We're curious. We are thinking broader. We're pumped. We're energized, and we need to move forward. So again, on behalf of all of our hosts, our presenters, our city, and our government, thank you so much for joining us for our community of practice. Have a great day.